Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming back. It seems that quite a number of people have disappeared. There's empty tables over there. Are they coming back? No. You're sitting all by yourself at a table with several cups on it. Suggests that anyway, what can we do to bring them in? Shall we say, free beer for those underage? Will that do it? Okay. Right. Well, we're coming to the fourth and final lecture that I give. We are having a roundtable symposium of some sort tomorrow, where I guess we'll be bringing some of this stuff together again, sort of putting it all into one. But this is my last actual presentation. And I want to talk now about the apostolic nature of the church, what we are doing with that. And I want to focus from the scriptures on 2 Timothy, second epistle to Timothy, chapter 3, which, although it has 17 verses, is actually quite short, so I shall read it through and then we can begin. Paul speaking to Timothy, he says, "This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with divers lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth. Men of corrupt minds reprobate concerning the faith. But they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was. But thou hast fully known my doctrine, manner of life, purpose, faith, long-suffering, charity, patience, persecutions, afflictions, which came unto me at Antioch, at Iconium, at Lystra, what persecutions I endured. But out of them all the Lord delivered me. Yea, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. But continue thou in the things which thou hast learned and hast been assured of, knowing of whom thou hast learned them, and that from a child thou hast known the holy scriptures, which are able to make thee wise unto salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. All scripture is given by inspiration of God, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, truly furnished unto all good works." What is the apostolic message? In this text that I've just read to you now, the apostle is writing to Timothy, one of his younger helpers. This is one generation handing on to the next. This is, if you like, the beginning of what we now call tradition. Because what is tradition? Tradition is handing on. I don't know whether you've ever thought about this, but there are a number of words in English which are connected to tradition that you don't think of initially. One of them is trade. Trade, commerce, because to trade is to hand things over to other people. Another one is traitor, because a traitor was somebody who handed over the scriptures to the persecutors in the Great Persecution. So it's interesting to see some of the other words that have come out of this. But tradition, of course, is vitally important because it is the way in which we are connected to the apostles. If there had not been a handing on from one generation to the next, we would not be here today. Or if the handing on had been, how should I put it, diverse. That's the great modern word, isn't it? You have to be diverse. We would all have inherited something, but it would have been something completely different. If you study the New Testament officially, in a university or context, one of the things you will be told, or at least will be suggested to you, is that in the New Testament church, there were lots of different groups. There was the Pauline school, there was the Johannine school, there were different ones here and there, and they competed with one another. And this is based really on what Paul says when he writes to the Corinthians in the first chapter. Some people who claimed that they were baptized by Peter, others by Paul, others by Apollos, and so on. There were factions within the church, and so this gives you an idea of the way the early church was. It was a kind of mixed bag of people following different teachers, and it was only later on that one party, the party which we now think of as the Orthodox, managed to hit the others over the head, basically drive them out, accuse them of heresy and so on, and establish themselves as the central people. Now, what these people, these scholars forget, there's various things they forget. First of all, that the early church didn't have the power to do that. The early church was an illegal organization. And illegal organizations do tend to get into arguments. Over things that only they understand. And of course, if they remain illegal organizations or very small, they scatter into 1,000 different pieces. All you have to do to see this is consider Marxism. Now, I don't suppose that's on the curriculum in Texas, but if you go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, you had all these little groups of people. You had Lenin and Trotsky and people like that, and the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and so on, and they were fighting back and forth. And if it hadn't been for the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks took over and sort of imposed their will on the rest, nothing, the whole thing would have split up into different groups, and indeed still is split up into different groups if you get into this world. If you get into Marxism seriously, I think you have to go to Harvard for that. But you'll find that in fact that it's very sectarian. There are all these little groups fighting back and forth, claiming the name of Marx, but they don't sort of come together very well on this. And this could have happened in the early church. It's not an impossibility, you see, that there could have been different groups going their separate ways. But what is remarkable is there is no trace of these groups, except in 19th century Tübingen scholarship. That's when these groups first appear, and so on. In the ancient world, there's no sign of them. There were funny heretics, of course. We heard about that in the sermon this morning, and the Gnostics and people like that running around. But they were so weird. They weren't mainstream. But there was never a church of Paul, a church of John, a church of Peter, and so on. The apostles didn't split up like this. They all were concentrated on Christ. And of course, the New Testament is a witness to this. I mean, why does the New Testament contain writings by completely different people? Peter, Paul, John. We know that Peter and Paul had their disagreements, but their writings are both in the scriptures. You have 4 Gospels and not one. There were people in the 2nd century, a man called Tatian, who didn't like this. He thought, well, there's only one Jesus, so there's got to be only one Gospel. And so he took the Gospels, the 4 Gospels that we know, and he homogenized them. He tried to write one out of them. And the only thing we know about Tatian is that he was a Baptist. And we know this because he not only homogenized everything, but he rewrote the text when it didn't suit him. And so when Jesus said, "I am the true vine," Tatian said, no, we don't drink. So he scratches this out and he said, "I am the fruit of the tree of the earth." Whatever that means, you're saying. So teetotalism is not a new thing. You find it down, I don't know whether he was under 21 when he wrote that, probably not. But I can't get over this, I mean, it's really weird. Anyhow, there we are, you see, in the 2nd century, this was going on already. Why were 4 Gospels preserved? You see, when they don't all say exactly the same thing. This was just a complication, you might say. Why didn't the 4 Gospels lead to 4 different churches? They would today. If people get different accounts of something, people will go off and follow these different people. This didn't happen. The early church stuck together. People who claimed to be of Paul, who claimed to be of Cephas, who claimed to be of Apollos, were told very bluntly, "We are of Jesus." The apostles are not to be divided like this. The apostolic witness is a single witness. It is one thing. It is to be kept together, and all the apostles contribute to it. And this is the New Testament as we have it today, come down to us as a single witness of the apostolic era. No attempt to homogenize, no attempt to delete things that aren't convenient, no attempt to privilege one account over the other, and say this is more authentic or less authentic. It's all thrown in there together, and we are given this as a complete legacy that we have to put together in our own minds. We have to systematize, we have to appreciate the different takes on these things. It's all one thing. And this is very remarkable, because when the church was finally legalized 300 years after it was founded, there was only one church. There were controversies in the church, yes. There was Arius and the Arian heresy, they were fighting, yes. There were people who dissented from this and that. But when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, made Christianity legal, what emerged from the shadows was one single thing. You see, crossing the whole of the Roman world. And this is very remarkable. When you think, how do they communicate? They didn't have internet and so on. I mean, how did somebody in Palestine know what was going on in Spain? Well, they didn't, on the whole. I mean, or they had only a vague idea. But there was enough sense of a common inheritance, of belonging together, and of course the origins of the creeds and so on, the creedal tradition, kept people together. Gave them a sense of belonging because they had this sense of inheriting the apostolic deposit. And it is here in the pastoral epistles in the New Testament that we meet with this for the first time. What does the Apostle Paul foresee? He foresees division. He foresees trouble. He knows that where there is a work of the Spirit of God, so there will be a work of Satan. I don't know whether you've ever thought about this, but the person who deals with hell and Satan more than anyone else in the Bible is Jesus. Jesus tells us more about the devil and the devil and his ways than anyone else. And why is this? Because, of course, Jesus is God who has become incarnate in enemy territory. Satan, who is the prince of this world, and Christ has come into the world. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And you see this very clearly in Matthew's Gospel, the temptations of Christ. I don't know whether you've ever thought about this, but the temptations of Jesus are really proof of his divinity. Why do I say this? Because the nature of temptation is that temptation offers what is possible. It presents to you something that you can do, an option that you have got, but it's the wrong thing. And you're supposed to say no. You see, you're given the freedom to say no. You are not tempted to do things that you cannot do. You see, I often say to my students, and they laugh for some reason, I don't know why they laugh, but I say, I would never be tempted to be an Olympic athlete. See, you laugh too. Why do you laugh? I mean, it's so cruel. Anyhow, not even the Paralympics, I'm afraid, in my case. But why not? Well, of course, it's not a real possibility, you see, and therefore not a temptation. But then when you realize this, and then ask yourself, well, what was Jesus actually tempted to do? What was possible for him? And you realize he's given the temptation of turning stones into bread, for instance. Well, those of you who've tried to make bread will probably know that you can easily turn bread into a stone, but not the other way round. You see, only God can do that. But this is the devil's backhanded compliment to Jesus, because basically he's saying, well, you can do this. And of course, what does Jesus do? Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. You see, that's what's written. He just quotes Deuteronomy back at Satan. And this is the battle. You see, this is what's going on in the New Testament. Jesus came to earth to fight the devil. It's a spiritual battle. I mean, we're involved, of course, because we are subject to the devil. I mean, Adam and Eve were tempted by Satan and fell into his grip. They didn't decide of their own free will to go off and sin. They didn't sort of wake up in the Garden of Eden one day and say, well, we've been here a week. What are we going to do now? Let's just have a little fun, disobey God, and see what happens. That's not the story. The story is that the serpent came and tempted them away. What did the serpent say? The serpent said, if you eat of this fruit over here, you'll be more like God. Don't you want to be like God? I mean, isn't that a good thing? Don't you stand up every Sunday in your church and say, you've got to become more like God, do what he wants and so on? What's wrong with that? Well, of course, what's wrong with it was not the goal, but the means to get there. You don't become more like God by disobeying him, which was the temptation, you see, and of course they fell into it, taking the shortcut, and it didn't work. It led to their destruction. But this is the world we live in. You see, we live in a world which is in the grip of Satan, and Satan does not like to let his people go. He wants to keep you in his power as long as he possibly can. And so when you become a Christian, when you are delivered from the power of Satan, you discover that you are now in enemy territory. And this is why the Christian life is spiritual warfare. Read that text, that chapter that I read again. The kind of thing, all who will live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. What a standard to measure yourself by. Are you suffering persecution? I don't want any testimonies right now, please. We've just had lunch. We'll save the blood and gore till later. But if you're not, in some way or other, ask yourself, why not? You see, if you ask what's wrong with the church today, what's wrong with the church today is we're not suffering persecution enough. We have it too good. It's too comfortable. Now, persecution is one of those things you can't sort of go out and wish it on people. You know, I'm not saying we should go out and provoke persecution. But we have to say to ourselves, well, this is the normal condition of the Christian, because we are the army of God in hostile territory. We have been delivered from the forces of evil. We are aware of the forces of evil. You see, Christians know more about evil than the people who are subjected to it, for the simple reason that they've been made aware of it. The more Christian you are, the closer to God you are, the more aware of sin and evil you become. Why? Because the more the light shines in your life, the more the darkness becomes painful. You know, you can't endure the darkness. The more you recognize the darkness for what it is. If you live in darkness, you don't notice. It's only when the light shines, that you see the reality for what it is. And this is the picture. This is what Paul is telling Timothy. This is the essence of the apostolic legacy. You will be persecuted. You will be dealing with enemies. There will be people who will come up and who will try to destroy the work of God which you have seen around. It was happening in Paul's lifetime. It was happening in the churches that he founded. You know, he'd start a church somewhere, move on somewhere else, and behind him would come somebody who'd stir up trouble. And so he'd have to write letters. This is why we have all his letters. You know, writing to you, foolish Galatians, how, you know, I told you all the truth, blah, 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 no sooner was my back turned than you were listening to these other people. This is the way it is. There was never a golden age, you know, when things were wonderful. And when, we can look back to and say, oh, I wish we could go back to the Middle Ages or back to the Reformation or back to the 18th century or whatever. No. You know, there are times and seasons of blessing, yes. There have been times in my life when I've been greatly blessed by God, and I'm very thankful for that. This will be true of you, no doubt, times in your life when this has happened. And, God is merciful and he is gracious to us in this way. But basically, we are soldiers in an army. And the army is fighting a spiritual battle. And this spiritual battle will go on as long as you live in this life. If you read the prayer book, you will see that in the service of Holy Communion, there's a prayer for the church militant here on earth. And you may not know what that means, but the church militant here on earth means the church which is engaged in spiritual warfare. And the opposite of the church militant is the church triumphant. But the church triumphant is not here on earth. The church triumphant is in heaven. And you graduate from the church militant to the church triumphant when you die, and not before. You know, as long as you're in this life, you're part of the church militant, and you must fight. Now, the other thing I would say, you need to realize about this, think about the army, the normal army, the United States Army. What kind of person does the army want? You know, does the army want, the average sort of, dare I say it, teenage American Rambo with his pickup truck and his AK-47 and anti-tank weapons, etc., in the back, you know, courtesy of the NRA, and so on, just in case the Chinese or the Martians or whatever should happen to invade. Who knows? Is this what the army wants? Believe me, if you ever met anyone from the army, if the United States ever declared war or was invaded by somebody like this, these would be the first people they would round up and take their weapons away. The potential defenders of freedom in the U.S., because these people are either nutcases or nuisances. And if there's a real war going on, they're the last people that anybody wants to be standing in the way. That's true. I've heard military people have told me this, you see. Plan A is to round up all these idiots and make sure they don't stop the real battle going on, because they're not trained for it. They're just exercising their constitutional right to bear arms, which is a completely different thing, as you know. And in the spiritual life, of course, we have the same thing. You see, we're full of Rambos exercising their rights, one thing and another, which is not the same thing as being a soldier in the regular army. You see, trained and disciplined and prepared for service. But now, if you are trained and disciplined and prepared for service, what is your ambition? Now, I'm not a military person. I said it. My father was in the army. My grandfather was in the army. I'm just thankful to the Lord daily that I've lived in an era of peace and I've never had to belong to any army. Thank goodness. So I'm not military in any way, but I do know that if you are that way inclined and you do sign on for army service, your ambition is to be one of the frontline troops. I mean, somebody in the army has to peel potatoes in the kitchen, yes, but that's not what you sign on for. You know, you sign on to be in the front line where the battle is. Now, I personally don't want to go to Afghanistan. I have no desire to go there. Afghanistan, as far as I can see, looks just like New Mexico, and having been to New Mexico, that's fine for me. I can leave Afghanistan alone. Thank you very much. But if you're a Marine or whatever they call them, these SEALs or whatever, that's what you want to do. You know, you want to be in there. That's your ambition, because that's what you're trained for. You see, that's what you're doing all your life. When I was teaching in London, 1982, the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands. You know, there's the Falkland Islands, South Atlantic. And one of my students was a naval officer who'd just been, finished his duty, 30 years or whatever, in the Navy, and was training. And we had to pin him down. He wanted to go back into the Navy. He said, I spent all those years training in the Navy and never fought. And now I leave the Navy, and what happens? The Argies invade the Falklands, and I could be there. You know, he wanted to grab his gun and go. Some of us were happy to sort of give him his gun and let him go, but this was the military mind. You see, that's not my mind, but the military mind. But I'm saying all this because spiritually, this should be our mind. You see, it should be your ambition to be in the front line. I mean, what's the point of serving in God's army, you know, if you're permanently on furlough? You see what I mean? Or if you're invalided out. That's not what you join the army for. The real crack troops are the ones who are doing the fighting. And it's not nice. You know, being in the front line in Afghanistan or wherever it is you are, this is not a pleasant, happy experience. It's a battle. But if you're called to do that, and that's what God wants you to do, then that's where you want to be, and you wouldn't be anywhere else. If you were somewhere else by accident or by mistake, you'd be dying to get back into the front line because that's where you belong. And this is the attitude we should have to our calling as Christians. You see, this is the apostolic witness. This is what Paul is saying. He's saying it to Timothy, he's saying it to you and me. You know, the time will come when people will be rotten to the core. People will be attacking everything we believe in. They will pretend to be doing the right thing, have an appearance of godliness, but actually denying the power thereof. Look at the world around you. Turn on the television, read the newspaper, listen to the radio, you know, and listen to what comes across. You know, nonsense, filth, everything else, marketed as what? Progress, liberty, freedom, you know. This is where we're going. You see what I mean? It's a destruction of our society being promoted as the best way to go, the enlightened future that we're all going to have. And it's always been like this. You see, you look at something like the Russian Revolution. You could have tears in your eyes listening to the revolution and all the things that they were promising. They were going to introduce heaven on earth, utopia. And what happened? It was hell on earth. The French Revolution. Freedom, the rights of man and all the rest of it. Where did it lead? The guillotine. The revolution devoured its own children. Because, of course, people could make the promises, but they couldn't deliver on them. They were advocating something that was an ideal, which sounded great, but when you try to put it into practice, you discover that people don't fit the ideal. There are no ideal people. And so because people don't fit the ideal, you have to wipe them out. It's the only way to get rid of them. You see, because they don't fit the pattern that you want to establish. We pride ourselves on living in a democracy. Oh yeah? Do you know that in the Western world today, and I'm not picking on the United States, it's exactly the same thing is true in Western Europe, we are less free in certain ways than people in the Soviet Union were. Because the Soviet Union was an officially atheist state. I lived there for a while, so I know all about it. Oh, it was a great place to live. Yeah, it really was, because very safe. No one ever robbed you, because no one had anything, you see. So it was, you could walk the streets at midnight, no one would mug you, it was fine, And, they targeted certain people, of course, put them in concentration camp, but as long as you weren't one of them, you were doing all right, really. And people were sort of around, and you'd talk about anything. I spent more time talking about God and faith and so on, and visiting people in their homes and sort of say, do you have a problem getting a Bible? Because that was the big thing in the West. People would smuggle Bibles into the Soviet Union. And so why are you smuggling Bibles? And, what happens? I said, well, the customs officers confiscate the Bibles. This is what used to happen. Oh, really? I said, yes. What happened to the Bibles? They'd sell them on the black market. Obviously, somebody wants Bibles, you see. And they said, do you have Bibles in your house? And so they said, well, yeah, we have a few. So they went around and collected. We ended up with 36 in this one house. 36. You've got more than I have. And here I am smuggling Bibles to you. It's nonsense. But there was a great deal of, I wouldn't say freedom is perhaps the wrong word, but let's put it like this. There was a great deal of spiritual awareness, spiritual consciousness, because it was officially suppressed. And of course you saw this with Pope John Paul II, and the great sort of revival in Poland and all that in the 1970s and 80s. This brought out a revival of the church, you see, because they were being persecuted in this way. Whereas here, where you are not officially persecuted, you just try praying in public sometime and see what happens to you. There are things you can't do. And you have to be very careful what you say and who you say it to and who you say it about. And there's a kind of political correctness, you see, which is sort of pressed down on everybody, where you really cannot express your beliefs if they're likely to offend somebody. And it's very hard to have very hard to believe anything that isn't going to offend somebody, you see, sooner or later. So while we have religious freedom on paper, in actual fact, it's very hard to say what you think without getting into trouble, you see, somehow or other. It's written out of the public discourse. Watch television. When do you, apart from the televangelist type television, when do you see any discussion or any presentation of Christianity? You see, it's just not there. I mean, if you got your understanding of American society from watching TV, you'd never know that there was any religion in the country at all. It's just not presented in the public sphere. And if you're not in that world, you wouldn't necessarily know anything about it. You see? And yet this is freedom, so-called. You see? So we need to be aware of this, that our battle is more subtle. You see, again, the great thing about the Soviet Union was you knew who the enemy was. You know, the enemy was the policeman, the enemy was the party member. And you knew who you were dealing with, and you knew exactly what they were on about. And I remember once going to the Museum of Atheism in what was then a city named after a Russian revolutionary, but we don't mention his name, is now called St. Petersburg. And going around there, and I was accosted by somebody who supposedly worked in the museum. Actually, of course, a secret agent, but you just get to know this kind of thing. And asking me what I thought about Lenin. Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned his name, but anyhow. And I said, oh, Lenin was a most remarkable man. Because I knew this was a setup. The most remarkable man. I said, yes. He said, Lenin became an atheist when he was 17. Joined the Communist Party at 17. Said, but he didn't make the revolution until he was 47. He said, and how many people do you know who still think the same way when they're at 47 than they did when they were 17? You know, I said, most people change their mind over that period of time. I didn't dare say grow up. That would have been provocative. But I said, change their mind. But Lenin, I said, you know, at 47, he was still thinking the same way he did when he was 17. Don't you think that's remarkable? And this man realized, I twigged, I rumbled him, as we say in England. I understood who he was and what he was on about. And he just smiled and said, thank you very much, and pushed off. You see, that's the kind of enemy you were dealing with. But as long as you knew how to deal with them, you could do that. You see, in this country, you don't know what would happen. They'd go to a lawyer and start suing you for something or other. You know. It's different. Now, I'm not saying we want to create the conditions of communist oppression so that we can do well and talk about God all the time. I'm not saying that. But just to realize, as much as we can, that persecution is not as bad as you might think. And that persecution, as Tertullian said, the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. You know, all who will live godly in Christ Jesus, as Paul, will suffer persecution. If it comes, if we suffer in this way, we should not despair. We should not say this is the end, of time and so on. We should realize that this is the world we live in, and this is the calling that we have. I mean, I'm not predicting anything. I'm not, pushing you in the front line. Don't worry. I don't have to do that. If the Spirit of God is working in you and in our life, this will happen. And the more we stand up for what we believe and say what we think, the more it will happen to us. And it will happen perhaps in very subtle ways. It will be done by people who believe that they're doing a public service. Because after all, we don't want these redneck fundamentalists around, do we? They'll find some way of making sure that we're not desirable and that the majority of the population will be against us. And all we've ever done is expressed our faith, our belief in things. To be very careful about this. But it may come, it will come. This is the apostolic deposit. This is the apostolic witness. How do we deal with it? First of all, as the apostle says, sound teaching. We need to know what we believe. Too many people in the church today have no idea what they really believe. They couldn't answer a question if it was asked to them. Now, you don't have to be a great intellectual in this. But you do need to know what your faith is and why you have it. It's very important, and our job in the church is to teach. We are here to teach what our beliefs are and why they are what they are. You know, ignorance has no place in the Church of God. We cannot tolerate this. Then we must have examples of godly living. There's no point thinking the right thing if you aren't doing the right thing. And here again, there's a tremendous gap between theory and practice. And it goes right across the church. It is astonishing how many people there are today, everywhere this is, who claim one thing, they think one thing, and do something quite different. You know, the way they live their lives, you would have no idea that they had any faith whatsoever. Because it doesn't show up in their relationships, the way they develop their relationships in their families and so on. It doesn't show up in their business life. You know, they don't apply Christian principles to the way they do business. It doesn't show up anywhere. Now, again, it's easy to criticize others. I'm not saying this, but we need to bear this in mind. We need to make sure that the way we live corresponds to the way we think, and the way we teach, the way we express our faith. And we must expect to be unpopular. The consequences of standing up and saying and doing the right thing are negative. I know this. This is one of my gifts, you see. I tell the truth. I get into trouble for it. I've got into trouble for it many times. But I've always been rescued from this because there is no answer to the truth. You see, I can say to people, I've said to people several times, okay, you don't like what I'm saying. I edit a journal, you see, so of course I write in the journal called Churchman, and I'm always criticizing something or other, and I get into trouble for it. And I said, well, fine, you know, I said, if you disagree, demonstrate that I'm wrong, and I'm very happy to publish your material, be fine. Never on any occasion has anyone ever taken me up on this offer. Why not? Because they can't. You see, they can complain, they don't like what I've said, but they haven't got a reply. So never be afraid of the truth, because the truth will defend you if you stand up for it. I've already talked about the world we live in. I'm not going to go on about that anymore. But the challenge for us, as I say, is to imitate Christ in the world that we have around us. And above all, to pass on to the next generation what we have received. The Athanasian Creed, which I haven't mentioned so far, but I'm going to mention now because it is brilliant on this particular point. It says, whoever, let me just get the exact words, whosoever will be saved, before all things it is necessary that he hold the Catholic faith, which faith, except everyone do keep whole and undefiled, without doubt he shall perish everlastingly. Now listen to this. Which faith, except everyone do keep. Notice the word keep. It's not believe or think, it's keep. It's something you've been given. You see, something that you were given to hold, to keep, and of course to pass on to those who come after. This is our duty. This is what we have always to consider. This is where, in our generation in particular, we are in great danger of failing. Why? For two reasons. One, because we believe that we have to do something new and different. We have to be original. You know, it's not enough to get something handed down from generations ago, hang on to it, and then give it to the next generation unchanged. No, you've got to play around with it, you've got to find something better, you've got to improve on the past. And of course, there's plenty out there in the sort of real world as well to back up that idea. I mean, if you inherited an abacus from your great-grandfather, and you keep it in your attic, and then you hand it on to your great-grandchildren, That's very nice, but what about the computer that's come along in the meantime? You know, passing on the abacus is not really a very good idea if that's what you have in mind. I mean, maybe nice as an heirloom and something, but it's not a practical option for the future. And so we live in a time of enormous technological change in this way, and it really is very, very rapid. You don't realize it. In my lifetime, and I mean, I'm not that old. You don't judge by appearances. I'm really not that old. When I was doing my PhD and after, my first book, my Creeds, Councils, and Christ, the book that you've named this conference after, where did I write this? You know, I wrote that book out by hand, sitting in a pub in London. I shouldn't have admitted that, should I? Well, I was 21, but still. Oh, that's appalling. I just can't get over it. Anyway, so at least you would have left me in peace. You wouldn't have been let into the place to disturb me. But no, I sat in a pub in London in the evenings, and the people in the pub thought, you know, I was this down and out writer, and they were very sympathetic, you know, because this could be the new Sartre or the new Hemingway or something. They didn't know what I was doing, so they sort of set a table across, and they fed me with. I got coffee, free coffee, all evening to keep me awake, and so on. And they thought, you know, when you become famous, let us know, and all this. They were really very nice about it. And the only thing that was annoying when I came to the publisher, I wanted to thank them in the acknowledgements. And the publisher says, no, you can't do that. He said, we'd never sell the book if people realized you wrote it in a pub. This is what you're dealing with. But my point is that I wrote it out by hand because, and then we had to type it up in an old typewriter because technology, you know, like computers and that, didn't exist. Well, they existed, but they were out of the range of people like me. I mean, I couldn't afford that kind of thing, you know. And it was only after the book was published and I got royalty payments that I was actually able to buy my first computer, would you believe, on the proceeds of Creeds, Councils, and Christ. I don't know what Athanasius would have said to that, never mind. And that's how recent it is. And then I said to my godson a little while ago, who's a brilliant mathematician and so on, he did a postdoc at MIT and all the rest of it, and he's about 30 now, and I said to him, I said, Mark, we were talking about technology and, you know, how it developed, and I said, Mark, have you ever seen carbon paper? And he scratched his head and said, no, I don't think so. He said, what is it? And I said, oh, yeah. I said, no. And stencils, you've probably never seen them either. No. And I was trying to work out, when did they disappear? And so I went through my notes, you see, and I was discovering, sometime in the 1980s, you know, I had stenciled notes and carbon papered stuff and everything. And then all of a sudden it vanished because the computer came in and Xeroxing and all the rest of it. And I thought, well, you know, that's not that long ago. But this world disappeared. You know, the world I grew up with, where we used to have to go to church at night and sort of turn out. Does some of you remember that? You know, turning out the bulletin for Sunday morning on the Gestetner, you know, the stencil machines to get it out. This world has vanished now. You see. But I also realize that I'm getting old because I can't work mobile phones, cell phones. This is the next generation. You see. To me, the mobile phone is an antisocial device. There's only one time I've ever wanted one, and that was when I was sitting in the upper deck of a double-decker bus in London, and there was this abominable creature sitting across from me, this man, who was on his phone, and he was going on, he was sort of saying, you know, he said, well, when the market opens in New York, transfer $1 billion from Shanghai to New York, get into Tokyo and see if you can put a few million in this. And I thought, this is some stockbroker or whatever, you know, doing his business on the phone. I thought, imagine this, you know. And at this point, it was the one time in my life I said, Lord, you know, I said, I really need a phone. Because I just wanted to pick up this phone and sort of say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, Your Majesty. I'm on my way to the palace, but I'll be late for lunch because there's this stuck in the bus with this dreadful man who can only talk about money. You know, that's all. But my point is, you see, the world is changing so rapidly that you're out of date before you're published. You know, things are moving, and this is the world we live in, that you just don't know what's going to happen next. It's going so fast. And so hanging on to something, you see, keeping something from the past and making it sure that it's pure and passing it on to the next generation, this is countercultural to us. People say, why do you want to do that? You know, it's way out of date. Gotta be. And we have to say no, because the things that really matter, the real values, are unchanging. Why are they unchanging? Because God is unchanging. I'm not against modern technology. I keep telling, I did actually buy a phone, a cell phone, and didn't know what to do with it. And then one day it rang, and I didn't know how to turn it off. Oh, it's a terrible experience. Anyway, I better not go into that. But I can see I'm gradually moving in this direction. I've got to get one, I keep telling myself. And I will do that one of these days. Don't worry, I haven't been lost forever. But it's hard. You see, it's hard in our modern world to say there are some things that don't change. There are some things that mustn't change. There are some things that we have inherited that we have got to hang on to because this is the will of God for us. This is the apostolic deposit. We have got to look at the world around us, we've got to stand back from it, and we've got to say, we're not going there. You know, we're staying where we are. We're going to pass on to our children and our grandchildren the faith and the beliefs which we have inherited and in which we have been brought up. We need to do this because the great lie of our time is that we can remake ourselves into anything we want to be. And this is not true. If I want, I can have a sex change operation. If I were younger, I would think of this quite seriously because in the modern world, you get higher pay if you're a woman. So maybe a sex change operation would pay off. But I'm too near retirement now for that to work, so I'm not doing it. But, no, I'm just being honest. You know, I'm telling you, I'm not, you know, I haven't got the appointment at 4 o'clock or anything. But, just so that you know, but the thing is, this is false. Because people who go through this kind of thing, it's only on the surface that they change. Underneath, they don't change. And what you're getting now, you see, is women, real women, who reject these transsexuals because they don't want them in the same restroom. And they certainly don't want to compete with them athletically and things like that. You see, there's only so much of a sex change that you can actually have. And yet we live in a culture where this is not only supposedly possible, but is actually promoted to some degree. You know, why not? That's what you want to go out and do. Go out and do it. We have to stand up against this mentality. It's not so much against particular laws or this and that, but it's against a way of thinking, which says that you can remake your own identity, you can remake your own life. You cannot. You are a sinner in need of salvation. You are a child of God saved by grace through faith. This cannot change. This will not change. This is the fundamental reality. You can change your name, you can change your nationality, you can change your sex, you can do all these other things if you want, but you cannot change that basic fact about yourself. And we need to preach this message. We need to get out there and say, you guys who think that you can remake your identity are just fooling around. You aren't getting to the base. You don't understand who you really are. You don't understand why you are in this world. You don't understand anything because you don't understand yourself. You certainly don't understand God. This is what we have to do, and we have to do it on the basis of the inheritance that we have, the apostolic deposit. And where are we going to find this? We find it in the Scriptures. The Bible is the center of our life. Learning it, preaching it, understanding it. Not getting caught up in silliness. You can read the Bible and read really silly things and get caught up in it. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking here about what the Apostle Paul says. It's valid for correction, for reproof, for training in godliness. We need to know this. We need to absorb this. We need to make it part of ourselves. We belong to these people. Augustine, the great Saint Augustine, he wrote in his City of God, he rewrote the history of the world. He dismissed the ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, and he said that they were great people for their time, but they're not our true ancestors. We who are Christians, although we are Romans and we inherit the Greek culture, he said, our ancestors are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs, the prophets, and so on. These are the people that we follow. These are the people to whose family, to whose inheritance we belong. This is our legacy. This is what we are here for. And his great book, one of the great books of Western civilization, does this. He just rewrites human history. And today, you see, look around you. You know, go back to the Bible, the Old Testament. Israel was a tiny country. People paid very little attention to it. Egypt was a great nation. What have we got from ancient Egypt? Pyramids. Very nice, but what are they good for? Nothing. Assyria, you know, again, very nice, but where is it? Mostly underground or in ruins. Babylonia, great country, nobody there. Israel has left nothing. There's nothing from ancient Israel, not even the temple. The Wailing Wall that's there was just an outer wall built by the Romans. It's not the Solomon's temple. But Israel had something else. Israel had the Word of God. We still read that Word of God today. We still call our children names like David and Rebecca, taken from that word. I don't think many of you will have called your children or will think of calling your children Nebuchadnezzar or Nefertiti. I mean, you might. People do funny things. And if somebody called Nebuchadnezzar, you know, plays football, well then maybe you will name your child after it, but it will be indirect. Basically, those cultures are dead. You know, they're dead and gone. We read the Old Testament all about the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, etc., and you think, who on earth were they? But the Israelites are still with us. It's remarkable, you know, after 4,000 years, Israel's still causing trouble. It's still at the center of the Middle East. I mean, how is this possible? You know, a little country with nothing to offer, not even oil. And there it is. Why? Because this is God's word working out in life. God has preserved his people. God will preserve us through persecution, through genocide, through you name it. The ups and downs of human history, they're still there. This is our promise. This is the apostolic witness. If God can preserve them, how much more will he preserve us? And that's where I'm going to stop. Any questions? don't be afraid. I mean, there's no such thing as a silly question, only silly answers. So don't feel you can't ask a question. No? Okay, well, we'll have tomorrow. Right.
You say the church is not under persecution. You're speaking here.
When I say the church is not under persecution, I'm talking about here in the Western world generally, in the sense that, I mean, you can go to church on Sunday morning and you can go wherever you want and you can go home again and you probably aren't going to be persecuted. I mean, this is not entirely true in Alabama, in Birmingham, because those of you, I speak here from experience, if you go to church on Sunday morning, you have to be very careful when you leave because the police sort of hide in the bushes behind to catch speeders who are going to lunch at Chili's or somewhere like that, so there is a kind of persecution of the church in this way, but I mean, this is minor and silly. You know what I'm saying. We're not openly persecuted. But on the other hand, it's very difficult in this society to be a Christian. I mean, try doing a PhD at a leading university in which God is a serious player. If you write on theology, maybe you can mention God, but let's say you were going to write on, say, biology, and you talked about the way God created the universe or something like that, you'd fail your PhD. You're not allowed to say things like that. You see what I mean? So there's this sort of thing, that it's written out of the intellectual culture of our time, that people who believe in God are regarded as redneck Southern fundamentalists. If you come from Texas, you can believe in God, but that's probably because you haven't got much else in your brain to keep it occupied. I mean, I don't believe that. Please don't misunderstand me, but that's the way the culture thinks. And you are ridiculed among the sort of intelligentsia. And I mean, all you have to do is just go to Barnes and Noble and forget the Christian fiction section, and go and look at something else. Go and look at I don't know, psychology, sociology, anything like this, and you'll be in a world where God doesn't exist, except as a pathological condition, that certain undesirable people might have. And this is the persecution that we suffer.
What about the church over in Syria?
The church in Syria?
The empires are financing these groups over there,
Yeah.
killing Christians and
Yeah.
so forth. Those people are certainly suffering persecution.
Oh, they are, yes. Well, the Christian population of the Middle East is being driven out, basically, by Islamic fundamentalists. I mean, it's happening in different... Sorry, what?
Well, many of those people are being financed by the United States and Britain.
Oh, of course, yes.
That are doing this.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, of course. I mean, but this is it, you see. They're not... I mean, we mustn't think that Western governments are charitable missionary societies. They're not. No, of course. I mean, they're paying for this to happen. Of course they are. But these people are being driven out. And what can you do? You see, it's an extremely difficult situation because very good friend of mine, close friend of mine, is president, I guess, director. Anyway, he runs the Bible Society of Egypt. And 2 years ago, when Hosni Mubarak was kicked out in Egypt, he sent a prayer letter around and said, freedom at last. We can, we pray that we can have freedom. Now, he sends prayer letters that we don't go out at night. We're in fear of we live in fear of our lives. He said our days are numbered. We don't know what's going to happen next. It's a tragic situation. And Egypt is a country. I mean, there are 10 million Christians there, not just 3 or 4. There's a huge Christian population, but it's being squeezed. And of course, anyone with any education, anyone with any contacts abroad and so on, they're leaving. I mean, why do you think places around here are full of Lebanese? The Lebanese who come here are all Christians, escaping the Lebanon. The Christian 50 years ago, the majority of the population in Lebanon was Christian. Now it's down to something like 20%. Why? Because they've all left. And they will leave. But what do you do? You see, what do you say? Do you say to these people, well, you shouldn't leave? It's all very well. But if the alternative is to be blown up in your house, at home, at short notice, how can you say that to people? Believe me, I understand, and I'm not justifying this in any way, shape, or form. But it's what's happening.
Islam is doing that. It's the United States and Britain that are promoting them to do that.
Well, I mean, yeah. But nevertheless, the Western governments, the United States and Britain, they wouldn't do that if there weren't people on the ground locally wanting it to happen. I mean, the United States is not actually encouraging this. They're aiding and abetting locals who want to do it. That's a different thing, but they're not sort of creating the situation. They're just profiting from it. I'm not saying that's right or good, but that's what it is. Yeah.
You were talking earlier today about particulars and Catholicity.
Yeah.
I was wondering how do you think that the polity of the church, how much does it factor into the definition of the church?
The polity of the church?
Yeah.
How much does the polity of the church enter into the definition of the church?
Yeah. And specifically in how it has its Catholicity.
Right. Well, I mean, the church has to have oversight. It has to have leaders. It has to have teachers. I mean, this is clear, from the New Testament. Exactly who these people are and how they were chosen and so on, this is not quite so clear. In particular, it's not clear what the difference was between a bishop and a presbyter, for instance. There's arguments about this. We don't really know. And it's extremely difficult to say because the difference between the New Testament church and now is that there are no apostles anymore. I mean, if the church in Corinth had a problem, they wrote to Paul and got his answer. We can't do that in the same way. So our organization has to be different. You see, I'm just saying right from the beginning, it can't just follow exactly what the New Testament did, what happened in the New Testament, because of circumstances which have changed and so on. Now, where it gets complicated, of course, is when the leaders of the church start claiming for themselves, particular authority. And of course, the extreme case is obviously the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. I mean, how much authority should he have, in the church as a whole? And who is he to claim this kind of thing? And here we have to say, and I mean, Roman Catholic scholars today would agree with this, at least to some degree, that there is very little evidence, in the early church that the Bishop of Rome had any special place. I mean, the early councils, Rome was virtually not represented. Certainly the Pope never went. Nicaea and so on. Where was Rome? Nowhere. This kind of thing. So we mustn't, fall for this in that way. And I'm always very suspicious of people who claim things for themselves. Because you think, well, what's the ulterior motive here? Having said that, of course, we do need organization. We do need polity. And it has to be based on a common belief and a common dedication to the scriptures and the apostolic teaching. And this is the question we must ask all the time. And we must say, well, are you following the teaching of the apostles? I mean, there is no perfect solution to this. If there were, we would have it, and we would know what we were doing. In our tradition, the Anglican tradition, we have bishops. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's hard to say. I wish I could turn around and say Anglican bishops have been wonderful examples of the faith and so on, but most of them have been highly unmemorable. They haven't, I'm not saying they've done great harm, but they haven't obviously done notable good either. They've just been there, carrying on, and I mean, fine, I'm not going to criticize them, but it's very difficult to promote this and say, well, this is what you've got to have, because otherwise you won't survive. So I'm not pro-bishop to that extent, but I'm happy to have them. I mean, I'm not, saying we shouldn't have them, and hope that we should have good ones, and try to encourage them and promote them for what they should be, rather than what all too often they turn out to be. Now, you can do this. See, this is difficulty I have, because you in your church are free to have the bishops you want, in theory. I, in my church, the Church of England, we don't have that freedom. We take what we're given. And what we're given, I don't know if you've ever seen this program, this British comedy, Yes, Prime Minister. Does that come over here? Have you seen the one on the bishops, the appointment of the bishops? When Sir Humphrey goes to the Prime Minister and they need to appoint a bishop, and the Prime Minister says, who are we going to get? And Sir Humphrey says, well, Prime Minister, the church likes to keep a balance. And the Prime Minister says, balance? What do you mean? And Sir Humphrey said, well, between those who believe in God and those who don't. And so he said, well, the Prime Minister says, I thought all bishops believed in God. And Sir Humphrey said, oh no, Prime Minister. When was the last time you met a bishop? And the Prime Minister said, well, he said, I don't believe in God. So I said, I don't associate with people like that. He said, oh, obviously. So the Prime Minister then goes home and talks to his wife, and his wife is a churchgoer. And his wife said, and he says, what am I going to do? I've got to appoint a bishop, and I don't believe in God, and now Sir Humphrey's telling me that none of them believe in God. And his wife says, well, I think you should do something new and radical. And he said, what's that? He said, appoint someone who believes in God. That's the Church of England for you. But having said that, I really must say that our new Archbishop of Canterbury is a very good person. I've known him since he was a student. We were students together a long time. I saw him a couple of weeks ago. He came to Cambridge to speak, and we renewed our friendship. I hadn't seen him for a long time. And it was 2 days before he went to Parliament and stood up and preached against gay marriage, or spoke in the House of Lords against gay marriage. And he said to me, he said, I don't want to do this. He said, I really wish I could talk about the gospel and not this. And I said, well, remember what Mordecai said to Esther. I said, you've been called to the kingdom for such a time as this. This is what this is your duty. And he said, yes. He said, thanks for that. And he stood up 2 days later. This was a Sunday, and Tuesday he stood up and against the whole Parliament, sort of said, this is wrong, and defended Christian marriage, and he's going to go on like that. He's a very good person, and we must pray for him. He's an excellent person. So, they can slip through the net, shall we say, somehow. But praise God. God is bigger than the church.
All right. Well, I think
Okay.
that's all we have time for. Let us give Dr. Bray a round of applause.